Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum. I'm Paula Gold, and I'm president of the Forum. Our sign language interpreter is Joan Watman. Tonight's program is the final one in our fall series, and we think it is a particularly appropriate one. Our topic is the CIA, America's Secret Foreign Policy. We will present two speakers with 2 points of view, and in so doing, we are responding to requests many of you have made on how to best present discussions of today's important issues. We encourage any of you with suggestions of topics or speakers or other ideas to fill out and return the questionnaires that were passed out and available in the lobby. The second half of our series begins in the spring, with Tom Wicker looking at the first 100 days of the new administration. Those of you who are members will receive a schedule in the mail before the series begins. If you're not a member and would like to make sure you know about our upcoming programs, please sign up for membership as you leave. In addition to the programs already announced, including Tom Wicker, Lester Thoreau, and Benjamin Hooks, we have plans for other programs which we think will be very exciting. By becoming a member, you also help the Forum continue to present programs like the one this evening. Now I would like to present tonight's moderator, Judge Rudolph Cass. Judge Cass is Associate Justice of the Massachusetts Court of Appeals, a lecturer at the New England Law Institute, and a specialist in urban affairs, land use, housing, and real estate. Judge Cass has been very active in civic and community affairs, including Boston Civic Center, Cambridge Center for Adult Education, Lena Park Development Corporation, and the Boston Shakespeare Company. He is also the former president of the Ford Hall Forum and a previous moderator of Forum programs. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Rudolph Cass.
Thank you, Madam President. Not until shortly after the end of World War II did the United States establish an agency whose sole mission was to gather and evaluate intelligence about foreign countries and to conduct intelligence operations. Earlier, each of the armed services and the State Department in varying degrees carried on intelligence operations separately. Necessarily, intelligence operations require secrecy. It is hardly practical that the budget of an intelligence agency be subject to line-item review by Congress. To that degree, the intelligence function is insulated from normal political processes. If the CIA were involved solely in intelligence gathering and processing, its insulation from political surveillance might not matter so very much. To the extent that the CIA acts in a policy-making or policy-executing role, it does matter. Does the CIA do so? Should it? How independently may it act? How does the agency function in a democracy? How should it? These are some of the questions which our speakers will discuss tonight. Both are CIA insiders, the first at the highest level. William E. Colby was director of the CIA from 1973 to 1976. That directorship capped a career in intelligence. He has experienced all its facets. During World War II, he operated with French and Norwegian resistance forces in German-held territory. Later, he served in Stockholm, Rome, Saigon, activity which included intelligence gathering, spying, if you will, political intervention and support, and directing paramilitary operations, the last in Southeast Asia. He has managed high-technology satellite surveillance systems. He has had responsibility for monitoring of Soviet performance, or not, of the First SALT Treaty. It fell to him, while director of the CIA, to answer the congressional and public skepticism about how the CIA was functioning. He was distinguished at that time for his candor and his recognition that in the end, under our Constitution, the CIA must be accountable, and at the same time with a concern for protecting its essential secrets and the sources of information. Following his resignation from the CIA, he wrote Honorable Men, My Life in the CIA. He now practices law in Washington and, not surprisingly, specializes in international law. He must certainly know who's who and where. Our other speaker, and who will be the first speaker this evening, is John Stockwell. He is a critic of the CIA. He, too, had a substantial career in the CIA, in his case preceded by a 3-year stint in the Marine Corps. He then spent 13 years as a CIA field case officer. He was a chief of station in Africa. He served in Vietnam, upcountry, beginning in 1973 through the evacuation in April 1975. He was commander of the Angola Task Force from 1975 to 1976. Both Mr. Stockwell and Mr. Colby left the CIA at about the same time. Mr. Stockwell also wrote a book, In Search of Enemies, which analyzed CIA covert action in Angola in terms which, with understatement, one may characterize as uncomplimentary. The United States government certainly wasn't happy about the book. It initiated legal action against Mr. Stockwell, actually based on a contract that people sign when leaving the CIA, and that requires him to submit future writing about the CIA to the CIA for censorship. As a consequence of the judgment in that case, the United States is to receive all of Mr. Stockwell's net profits from In Search of Enemies. So he is on the lecture circuit. Mr. Stockwell.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight to share with us this debate of CIA covert action. I think it's important. And the Ford Hall people for making it possible, and Mr. Colby for agreeing to debate. To correct a couple of details of varying importance, I refused when I left the CIA to sign any papers. The ruling is based on a paper you sign when you go into the CIA many years before you know what you're getting into. At least I knew what I was getting into. Not that that makes a great deal of legal difference. I would say that if the CIA has a real genius, it's in the realm of dissimulation, semantics, being able to take activities that people outside of the intelligence business would find unacceptable, illegal, immoral, sometimes even possibly depraved, and finding words for them that make them sound palatable or at least not quite so ominous and frightening. Just to give you a couple of examples, inside the world's richest spy organization, the CIA, you don't use the word spy because it has a pejorative ring. You're not seducing people to commit treason against their countries by being your spy. You're inviting them to join you in the struggle to keep the world free. We gave lots of money to lots of people, but we never bribed anyone, ever. What we were doing was giving them money to solve their financial problems so they wouldn't be distracted as they joined us in the struggle to keep the world free from communism, et cetera, et cetera. By the same token, part of the court order against me reads that I have to submit everything I write in the future to the CIA, not for censorship, that's what communist countries do, for review. So they go through and review it out with black grease marker pencils and tell me what I can and cannot publish. They teach you in the CIA how to live cover, how to devise cover, and how to live cover. When you go overseas, you practice this, and it means in simple English that everything about your life is a lie. The friends you make overseas, you don't tell them the truth about what you're doing, you tell them your cover stories. Your wife, certainly your children, everyone, you lie to them. You become literally professional liars when you live and work in the CIA. These techniques, of course, are essential to the intelligence operations. Mr. Colby studied these techniques in the OSS, and he used them to survive during World War II behind enemy lines. After World War II, he joined with other people from the OSS to form the CIA and use these techniques during peacetime. As Judge Cass noted, he had a long and very distinguished career holding many high offices. He's best known to the public for being in charge of the Phoenix program in Vietnam, which killed 22,000 people by his count, and being director of the CIA during the Senate Church Committee's investigations of covert action, when the public was becoming aware of the things the CIA had really been doing for all these years. When he retired, with the help of a ghostwriter, he produced a book, an autobiography, which he titled Honorable Men, My Life in the CIA, and I thought about that a lot. I had two opportunities to observe Mr. Colby's policies personally. They affected me a great deal. One of them was in Vietnam in April 1975 during the evacuation. As you all recall, 147,000 Vietnamese were gotten out and brought into this country, 100,000 gotten out and into other countries. To date, a total of 700,000 Vietnamese, I believe, have been brought eventually into the United States. And at that time, by decision from the CIA director, Mr. Colby, we failed to get out our own Vietnamese employees. The State Department got out virtually all of its employees. The Defense Attache's office, USIS, and AID saved employees and got them out down to maids and chauffeurs. And the CIA burned its files by orders from our leaders, saved ourselves, got on the plane and said, bye now, and left behind 3,000 to 4,000 of our employees. That unfortunate decision by Mr. Colby led to two best-selling books about the CIA. Mr. Frank Snepp resigned, wrote his book Decent Interval, and a couple of years later, very much part of my motivation to quit, I could no longer respect this organization if in a crunch, not by accident, but by decision, we would dump the people that we hired that were dependent on us. Again, during the Angolan operation in 1975, which I was the chief of the Angolan Task Force, like a colonel, like a chief of staff, with other people making the decisions, my job to help implement them, Mr. Colby had the responsibility in that program of briefing the Congress. This is under the Hughes-Ryan Amendment that provides that the President has to submit a finding for each covert action and that the CIA director must brief the Congress on the details. He gave 35 formal briefings to congressional oversight committees in which he gave them false information about what we were doing in Angola. This was the primary reason eventually that I left the CIA. I found this secret police organization of which I was part, to which I had sworn loyalty, setting itself above and beyond the law. The questions on which he delivered false information were legitimate and important questions. The legislators were concerned about the CIA's involvement with the South African Army fighting in Angola. If we had been so involved, it would have been possibly illegal. There was international law and U.S. law against such military involvement with South Africa. Mr. Colby assured them that we were staying well away from the South African forces. The legislators were concerned that the CIA might have to do with these mercenaries that were appearing all over Angola. Mr. Colby assured them we had nothing to do with them. The legislators were concerned that we were putting U.S. advisors into Angola, of course, the traditional big step in the escalation of our involvement in fighting overseas. He assured them that we had people going in and coming out just to gather information on what was happening, no one sleeping inside the country. And they were concerned that we were introducing arms into the conflict. And he assured them that we were not, that we were delivering arms to Zaire to replenish Mobutu's supplies because he had depleted his army too much by sending arms into Angola himself. The truth was the CIA was coordinating military activity with the South African Army in great detail. I'll give you an example. We would have C-141 airplanes fly to Kinshasa to be met at 2 o'clock in the morning by two C-130s from the South African Army. We would transload our arms directly onto their planes for them to deliver into Angola so all three planes could leave Kinshasa in the dark of night before reporters could see it. And they would distribute our arms for us to our mutual allies, the UNITA forces. We had four. We projected, budgeted, sent people overseas to recruit, and delivered into Angola 4 mercenary units, white mercenaries to kill blacks inside Angola. Controversial program, and we were doing it. The CI had 24 paramilitary advisors sleeping inside Angola, installing communication systems, training in the use of weapons, helping to plan and direct battles. And finally, as I just told you, we were shipping arms through Kinshasa, skipping directly into Angola, hundreds of tons of arms. At the same time, while Mr. Colby was reassuring the Senate Church Committee that we were being careful, the CI was careful that none of its propaganda overseas, directed overseas, was permitted to leak back into the United States to influence United States public opinion. We had 2 teams of propagandists working full-time in New York City and Washington, D.C., targeting primarily the U.S. media and United States legislators. The public's in a position today to have a pretty good sense of the truth about covert action, despite the misstatements and disinformation that's traditionally put out about it. The Senate Church Committee brought out a lot of information. Congressional debate has brought out a lot of the details about the current operation in Nicaragua, for example. Documents have been obtained under the Freedom of Information Act, and then books have been written by insiders like Mr. Colby and myself and Mr. Snepp and others. The Senate Church Committee found in 1975 that the CI had run several thousand covert actions since 1961, and the heyday of covert actions was in the 50s before 61. It found that the CI had run several hundred covert actions a year. It's been in business for 37 years. We're talking about possibly 10,000 or more covert actions. Many of these are trivial, not terribly important, although all of them illegal in terms of international law and the local law in the countries in which we're doing them, and often in terms of United States law, but many of them are quite bloody. The one in Nicaragua today has killed over 7,000 people, mostly women and children. That would be one of the less bloody major covert actions. The one in Indonesia in 1965, where the CI was busy stirring up the pot, adding to tensions. The tensions eventually erupted, and possibly several 100,000 people died as a result thereof. If you add up all the covert actions, 10,000 here and 20,000 there, and then, of course, the Indonesian situation, you come up with a minimum figure of perhaps 1 million people who've been killed as direct victims of CI covert actions. Now, you look at these people and say, what kind of people are they? Our leadership today, addressing the parliament in London, says we're going to turn the Soviet Union into a pile of ashes. So there apparently is the mood in this country that a good communist is a dead communist and all that, which I certainly don't subscribe to, and I hope other Americans do not. But the problem with that is that these million people, direct victims of CI covert actions, aren't communists. They aren't Russians anyway, certainly not KGB. The common denominator you find when you study these dozens and dozens and hundreds and then thousands of covert actions is that they all are done against small countries or third world countries. The people that die in these things are people from the Mitumba Mountains of the Congo, the jungles of Southeast Asia, and now the hills of northern Nicaragua. We say we're opposing Cuba and communism in Central America. We say we're opposing the Sandinistas, and so we slaughter people in northern Nicaragua. Far more Catholics than communists among these million people or more dead. And we're doing it today. Congress oversight committees tell the press that the CI is running over 50 covert actions. That's nearly in 1/3 of the countries around the world today. The largest one, the most famous one, is Nicaragua, where we have this primer recently falling into the hands of the press, which outlines a program of assassination and even killing their own people to make martyrs out of them. And the techniques used by the CIA in northern Nicaragua can only be called terrorism. There cannot be another word for them if we are, in fact, dealing with simple English and the truth. The CIA has run many other operations over the years, and President Reagan has told us that he's restoring it back to fullest function. Under Mr. Colby's era, and partly under mine, the CIA had a policy of opening American citizens' mail. This was illegal. The MK-Ultra program, it experimented extensively in over 200 medical schools and mental hospitals, including Harvard, on American citizens with LSD, other drugs, and with disease. It had programs of manipulating student and labor organizations, programs of surveillance, penetration, and manipulation of U.S. political and social organizations. And throughout this period of time, it has been lobbying for and demanding a law that would deprive an Official Secrets Act, that would deprive the American people of the legal right to know what their government is doing with their tax dollars in their name. It's been partially successful under President Reagan. The Names of Agents Bill was signed into law. Covering all of these activities, we've had the traditional program, policy of CIA leaders, CIA officers, public officials defending the CIA by lying, by disinformation, by finding words that would deflect the public wrath and public disgust for what the CIA was doing. Colonel White, one of the more candid officers who was in on the founding of the CIA and served also a long and from within the CIA distinguished career, wrote from retirement to a friend and then permitted it to be published, quote, "I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, cheat, steal, kill, rape, and pillage with the blessings of the All-Highest? I submit to you that if these men are in fact honorable, then I'm an Egyptian belly dancer. If these brutal, cynical activities are in fact essential to our great nation's security, then I submit to you also there's little hope for continued freedom in this country, and there's little hope for survival of the human race in this bomb-ridden planet that we live on." I dedicated my first book to T.U. Braxy I, a Vietnamese case officer that was left behind in Vietnam. I dedicate my part of this debate tonight to the other 3,000 employees that we left behind unnecessarily, that have spent, most of them, the last 9.5 years in Vietnamese reindoctrination camps. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stockwell. Mr. Colby.
Thank you. I'd rather thought we were going to talk about covert action generally and whether we should be doing it and how, if so, how, and that it wouldn't become just an ad hominem attack on me and my background and so forth. Let me lift the subject up to that level and try to cover some of the points that Mr. Stockwell made as well. I doubt that I can cover every one, but I'd be glad to go back to any one in the questions. Covert action, which is what we're talking about here, it's not a new thing. The United States benefited by one of our first covert actions, effective over here, when the French government set up a small cover company to conceal the fact that they were sending some weapons and money to some colonists in America fighting against the King of Great Britain, but keeping the matter secret because the King of France did not want to be blamed by his brother King of England for supporting those terrorists, freedom fighters, whatever you call them, on the American soil. Now that was a covert action. We happen to think it was a pretty good one because we benefited from it in our revolution. We've had other covert actions in our history, some good, like that one, and I can number a number of them that I think were quite effective and helpful, both in the political field and in the paramilitary field, in places like Western Europe, in places as far up in the country as Laos. On the other hand, we've had some real disasters, no question about it. The Bay of Pigs was obviously a disaster, although I do ask you to think what the reaction of the American people, and maybe a lot of other people, would have been if the Bay of Pigs had succeeded. I think it would have been met with a roar of approval, and if you'll also consider the history of that circumstance, if that revolt, supported covertly by the Americans from outside, designed to land a force and begin the liberation, unquote, of Cuba, had succeeded in April 1961, and Cuba had not been under communist control in October 1962, then Khrushchev would not have had a place on which to put offensive missiles and put America under direct nuclear threat for the first time in history. Now, we live with nuclear threat today, we know, throughout the country, throughout the world. But at that time, it was a reckless gamble by Mr. Khrushchev to change the balance of power in the world. Here, a covert action might have forestalled it. A smaller action than a nuclear exchange or the edge of it, which is where we got to, might have accomplished more through that action than by letting the situation deteriorate into a mutual nuclear threat. I think, therefore, the question is not whether to engage in covert action. The question is, do we have a decent system for deciding how and where and what kind of covert actions to follow? Now here, certainly, we have seen a great deal of progress in recent years. In fact, when CIA was established and the covert action mission first given to it, a presidential commission gave CIA some of its first marching orders, told it to go out and be more ruthless than its adversaries, if necessary. Now, if you had submitted that particular bit of guidance to the American people in 1947, faced with the image of Joseph Stalin and the threat that was perceived of communist infiltration and subversion throughout the world, then I think the American people would have resoundingly ratified that particular guidance. The American people have changed their mind, and so has the CIA. Over these years, there has been a change in that kind of approach. We were shocked in 1975 by some of the excesses, and I would call them excesses because I'm the guy that brought them out, that were brought to light in the mid-'70s about some of CIA's activities over the past years. Now, what did we do about it? What we did about it was not to bar all covert action. Senator Church, in his final report, looked at this subject, said that he was uncomfortable with covert action. It should only be used in certain cases, but he was not about to say that it should be taken out of the arsenal of potential American weaponry for the living in the world of today. Therefore, he said, let us get some more protections around it. Let's get some more caution in its use. And I think this is what has happened as a result of this progressive change in the attitude of America toward this kind of activity. Today, any covert action, any action beyond pure intelligence gathering, must be the subject of a considered judgment by the internal elements of the administration, the executive branch, leading up to a signature by the President that that particular action is important to the security of the United States. Now, you can be cynical about that if you want to and say, well, the President would sign anything. But there's another provision of it which says that it will be reported to the appropriate committees of the Congress and the two intelligence committees of the Congress. Now, this was a new development in the mid-'70s, because prior to that time, Congress said, and literally said in the case of several good senators and congressmen, we don't want to know. Just go over and do it. Don't tell us. We'll send the money, but you just take care of that, and don't tell us anything about this. A few senior members of Congress were generally advised, but the Congress as a whole didn't want to know. Now, that is a violation of the constitutional system of the United States, because we Americans don't make all our decisions as individual voters, but we do delegate to the three arms of our government decision-making about our policies: the executive, the Congress, and the judiciary. And so in the mid-'70s, we saw an application of that constitutional separation of powers to the intelligence business. We brought intelligence under our Constitution. And in this history, you have seen in recent years, and Mr. Stockwell was engaged in one, in Angola, I went and briefed on our programs. I deny that I lied to the Congress, and I would add that this was the matter of some inquiry by the various committees, whether I had lied to them, and they concluded that I had not. At least nobody ever said that I had from responsible leaders of the Congress. Now, the fact that we said that we had people in Angola, yes, we did. I did say we did have it. I said that we did know what the South Africans were doing, but that we were not running a joint program with joint control. And that was my briefing of the congressman. I said that we were supporting various revolutionary groups within Angola and providing them weapons and training and various other things. So there was no question about our support of it. But in December 1975, the Congress of the United States voted a resolution that we stop all paramilitary aid to Angola. And at that point, the aid to that revolutionary element, all the revolutionary elements in Angola, stopped. Why? Because the Congress had decreed that it stop. The constitutional separation of powers had worked. We currently see in the Nicaraguan Contra operation a difference of opinion in our high levels of government. The administration thinks that it's a good idea to support the Contras in their effort against the government of Nicaragua. The Senate committee has agreed with it. The House of Representatives and its committee has taken a very strong position that we should not be engaged in that operation. They have taken such a strong position, I might say, led by a man I consider one of the finer representatives in the Congress these days, Congressman Boland from this area, as you know, who is a very responsible head of that committee, who has taken a very responsible view of his oversight of CIA, supported some things and objected to others. And in this case, he has objected to the Contra operation, and as a result of his leadership, and it's taken him a few problems through the complicated procedural aspects of our congressional system, he has achieved a situation today whereby aid to the Contra movement by the CIA has been stopped. It has been stopped here as of a couple of months ago. There is a chance that it be revived next spring if the House of Representatives votes to revive it, but not if it doesn't. What I'm saying here, I'll stay out of the argument about the Contra operation itself. I'm fairly ambivalent about it. I'm not very enthusiastic about it. I don't think it's a very good idea because it mixes up what I think should be the major strategy in Central America of building strength in the democratic countries, in Salvador and Honduras, and in encouraging the continued democratization, and it's starting, of Guatemala. There are steps in that direction being taken. The other countries have had their elections. Mr. Duarte was elected here recently in a free election. And I think that's what the policy should be, supporting that process and the social and economic improvements that has to accompany that kind of a political. But my point is not whether the Contra operation is good or bad. My point is that we Americans have decided that we are going to run these things under our constitutional system. And when we agree that the program should be continued, as apparently, and I don't know this of my own knowledge, I'm just reading what I see in the press, as apparently we agree that some help should be given to Afghan freedom fighters, then the program continues. But if we disagree that help be given to the Contras in Nicaragua, then the program has been stopped. We are conducting this through our constitutional system. I think this is the achievement we've arrived at. You can say we should never do it, but I think there are cases in which most of us, and I will cite the late Senator Church, as a high critic, but nonetheless believing that sometimes it might be necessary. And, on the other hand, we need a careful control of it. Now, I think that should be the key to our discussion. How do we exert this control? How do we influence our government in this direction? Is it possible for the CIA to run these operations without any control whatsoever these days? And the answer is no. There are A, too many newsmen. There are B, too many good staff members on the committees of the Congress. And they do learn these things when they want to learn about them. And they do want to learn about them because the congressmen, like Mr. Boland, have taken responsibility to know about these. There was a criticism of the mining operations and on the Contra operation. And one of the criticisms was by the Senate committee that it didn't know about them. And the CIA pointed to a few lines in a briefing that said that they had told them. Well, Mr. Boland looked at it, and he said, I disagree with this program, but the CIA told me all about it, because he went back on it and asked further about what those lines meant, and he got a full briefing. And so he, while disagreeing with the merits of the program, believes that the system is working properly. I think that's the way we ought to look at this, that there may be some situations around the world in which we would want to conduct covert action. There would be others in which we do not. I'm the fellow who doesn't believe in assassination. I wrote the first directives that said we would not engage ourselves in assassination. And I've carried out that program and stopped them in various places. People talk about the Phoenix program. I set up the Phoenix program in order to reduce the abuses in Vietnam. And they did reduce as a result. And I think if you will look at Mr. Stanley Carno's recent history of Vietnam, you will find that that's pretty well stated, that in effect the Phoenix program did bring some order to that kind of a struggle, that backstage struggle that was going on there, and that today the communists consider it as one of the more serious programs that they had to deal with during that period. Now, to mention the last thing that Mr. Stockwell said about the removal of our employees in Vietnam, certainly there are people there that were left behind. When a nation collapses, a lot of people get left behind. A lot of people were left in France in 1940 when France collapsed. And a lot of people were left in Vietnam. And a lot of the wrong people got out because they happened to be sitting next to the airplane and jumped on it ahead of somebody else. There's no question about it. But during the collapse of a country, to get 140,000 Vietnamese out was not a bad record at that time. I wished we'd gotten them all out too, but the collapse was there and it was taking place and they all did not get out. Now, I am emotional about my friends that have been lost in various parts of the world, but I don't let it confuse me into feeling that we should not do what is necessary to carry out our obligations in this world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Colby. We will now go into the question period of the program. Let me remind you that we are on radio, and so that the question can be heard over radio, I will repeat the question after it has been put by you. May I also, as usual, make a plea for questions rather than for speeches. Why don't I begin? Can you, is it possible to turn down those lights at the extreme sides? It makes it difficult to see who's down there. Something's happening. Good. Why don't I start in this section? Yes, back there, the blue shirt.
Mr. Colby, in your opinion, who killed John Kennedy? Was it a conspiracy or was it Lee Harvey Oswald?
It was a crazy...
The question is addressed to Mr. Colby, and in his opinion, who killed President Kennedy? Was it a conspiracy or was it Lee Harvey Oswald?
It was Lee Harvey Oswald, in my understanding, and I believe that he worked alone. That has been investigated by the Warren Commission a number of years ago, and more recently by the House Committee on Assassinations, which although it got in one little confusion by the acoustic report, has since amended that to essentially adopt the same conclusions as the Warren Commission.
This section.
There are charges, Mr. Colby, that the CIA has become politicized. It seems that every new president chooses his own director. I'm wondering why there isn't a system like that in the FBI, in which now the director is chosen for a 10-year period and is independent of presidential control.
The question is the question to Mr. Colby is that there have been charges that the CIA has been politicized and that every newly elected president chooses his own director of the CIA. Is it not possible to have a CIA director named who would span administrations?
Well, that was the original idea, and certainly when President Kennedy reappointed Allen Dulles and J. Edgar Hoover, he was trying to make the point that these are two non-political jobs. With all due deference, I don't think it's feasible. I think that anyone as heavily involved in assisting the formulation of policy as the director of CIA pretty much has to be somehow related to the president. Otherwise, the president won't use him, won't deal with him. I ran into a little bit of that myself in one time, that I wasn't part of the inside team, and that limited the effectiveness of the CIA in getting its word up to the top levels, to the president himself. I think the arrangement they have now with a politically appointed director and a career deputy director to run it is very comparable to the system that they have in the Army, the State Department, all the rest of it, and I think it's the way we Americans expect most of our important departments to run, with a politically responsible chief, career people to help them run the machinery, but responsive to the administration in turn. If the politicization affects the judgments, the assessments, then you're going to hear about it. You're going to hear about it either from disaffected analysts, and we've heard a couple of those, or you're going to hear about it from the congressional committees who criticize that the things are being loaded either on one side or the other. So there is that protection against it becoming too politicized.
The woman in the second row, I think.
Mr. Colby, during the Church Commission's investigation of the CIA, it was Richard Helms who was found guilty of perjury and had to pay a fine, no jail sentence. But what was the role, actually, of the CIA in the assassination of Allende?
May I try to repeat the question? The questioner says that during the Church Committee hearings that Richard Helms, a former director of the CIA, was found to have committed perjury. Then the questioner goes on to ask, what was the role of the CIA in connection with the assassination of President Allende of Chile?
The charges against Mr. Helms came from some testimony that he gave in which he thought that he was expected to keep secret a particular activity, and he thought that the questioner knew very well what the real answer was, and he gave the answer that was expected, and this was then opened up and charges were brought against him. Mr. Helms took what's called nola condendere. He did not admit or deny the charges, but that in law affects as an admission. And he was therefore fined, a very minor fine for it. He has been rehabilitated in recent years from that situation. It was around the Allende thing. The important thing to remember about the whole Chile operation is dates. The CIA began helping the center parties in Chile, Christian Democrats and nationalists, in 1964. In the election of actually it began in 63. The election of 1963 and 4. The election of 64 began in 63. The purpose was to strengthen those parties against the potential victory of Mr. Allende, which even at that time was felt to be a negative possibility due to his associations with Mr. Castro, Mr. Castro's hope to extend the Cuban Revolution into the rest of Latin America. You can argue about whether this is a good idea or not, but that's what the thought process was. This kind of assistance went on for the next several years in Chile from CIA to, again, these center parties, not the right wing, not the military, during those years. In 1970, the next election, the presidential election, came up. And CIA essentially at that point, wanted to kind of stay out of it. They did a little propaganda work, but they essentially wanted to stay out of it, at which point Mr. Allende proceeded to get a plurality in the election, to the shock of our president at the time, President Nixon, who thereupon directed Mr. Helms to go down there and, pursuant to the Chilean Constitution, get the Congress not to ratify that plurality election. And this brought about an operation which went on for several weeks, 6 or 8 weeks, during which CIA did talk to the military and talked to the right wing and ran around and tried to bribe people and all the rest of it to accomplish what the president had offered, and failed. And Mr. Allende was ratified as president. The CIA then stopped that level of activity and went back to its program of assisting the center parties and some newspaper, radios, so forth, that were under pressure from Mr. Allende, looking toward the next elections of 1976, which they hoped that the center parties would win. In the interim, the situation deteriorated so much, in part because of other American government programs, such as the deprivation of IMF funds, economic pressures on Chile, and so forth, that the military did begin to move. But in the spring of 1973, I sent a message down there after I talked to some of my people, which said, look, you follow what's happening, but don't get involved with the military in any kind of a coup. Because if they're going to run a coup, it's going to be their coup, not ours. We may get blamed for it, but it's not going to be our coup. We are not going to be involved in a coup in this situation. And the CIA was not involved in the coup. Mr. Allende was killed under ambiguous circumstances in the course of the coup, but it wasn't a CIA coup, and the CIA did not kill Mr. Allende.
Judge Cass, please.
Yes, Mr. Stockwell, go.
Yes, I understood when I was invited here that we would both respond to the questions.
Well,
and I'm also
Mr. Stockwell, lest there be any misunderstanding, you were always invited to respond to questions.
Well, I wasn't given an opportunity. I also am concerned at the extent at which this disinformation continues to flow. This thing about congressional oversight, placing the CIA and the government in the Constitution. To begin with, Mr. Colby made the point that the Congress stopped us, ordered us to stop in December of '75 what we were doing in Angola, and he said the arms stopped flowing. 28 more plane loads of arms flowed in the next 2 months with the CIA director's approval, just for openers.
I deny that.
The record is clear. You can read my book, and that's illustrative of the way this thing works. You get into things like mining the harbor, and there's a little clause in there, and the CIA has covered itself, and you read the exact wording of this and that and the other, and they can wiggle off the hook. But if these things were discussed openly in front of the public, so that our legislators themselves were held accountable to the people for what our government's doing, very few of them could be approved. Now, the Warren Commission study, the assassination of JFK, it may have been a lone gunman, but you have to consider the fact that 4 intelligence agencies had contact with Lee Harvey Oswald before the killing, and these same 4 agencies were permitted to perjure themselves to the Warren Commission. This came out years later in the House investigation. This has to raise gigantic question marks in everybody's mind.
Let me, yes, that, go ahead.
ask both of you. The general defense of the CIA is that covert operations are necessary to defend political democracy, trade union rights, and respect for human rights around the world. If that's the case, sir, I would wonder why there are no CIA operations against the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile, the apartheid regime in South Africa, or the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines, and instead, whereas it's well known there is no political democracy, trade union rights, or respect for human rights, and instead you have CIA operations against Nicaragua, which is the only country in Central America which is attempting, despite many problems, to move forward in this direction.
The questioner asks that the general defense of intelligence operations generally is that it is a necessary trade-off for the preservation of human rights. Why then, he asks, are there no CIA operations involved to against General Pinochet in Chile, against South Africa, against President Marcos in Chile? Why are there, I beg your pardon, in the Philippines, why are there covert operations against Nicaragua? Mr. Stockwell, since this question has been addressed to either one of you, why don't we take you first?
Thank you. I think it's because there's a definite bias on the part of the people that direct the CIA and the CIA directors. The CIA has waged a war against democracy around the world. The roots of this go back to Thomas Jefferson when he said that revolution didn't look so much fun after we had ours when you were considering other people's aspirations to freedom. You can read Walter Lefebvre's book, Inevitable Revolutions, to get a feeling for our policies in Central America before the CIA existed, of always supporting the oligarchies. We'll live with a democracy as long as it works in our interests in third world countries where we have the power to influence them. But when they begin to assert themselves in the interest of their own people, we engineer coups and install dictatorships in power because you can sign a contract and do business with a dictator, invite him into the circle of rich people in the world, and to heck with the people of the country. What is it, 18 or perhaps 36? Constitutional democracies that have been overthrown by the CIA in favor of dictatorships around the world. This is why I submit that we should have open debate so the people of this country can understand the truth about these things and perhaps give our government guidance in doing the right thing instead of time after time the wrong thing in country after country.
I didn't use those justifications for covert actions. Sometimes they apply, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes there were other reasons for the covert action. What I'm saying is that the justification of individual covert actions has to be looked at in each case and should be subjected to a process by which appropriate elected members, representatives of the people, make a decision as to whether that makes sense or not. In basic answer to your question, since the purpose of a covert action is the security of the United States, that's the fundamental thought process, it goes back to some very old ethical and religious doctrine, which is the just war concept. Now, if you know about what a just war is, a just war depends essentially, you can go into several more pieces of it, but there are two major elements. It has to be in your self-defense and not for purposes of aggression. Now, we have not always conducted that kind of a just war. Just ask the Mexicans. They know we haven't. So I'm not saying we've always done it that way, but I'm saying that is a point, that you are allowed to conduct war or covert action for your defense. Now, the fact is that if somebody like Mr. Pinochet is not a threat to the United States, then there is not a basis upon which you legitimately can go and try to overthrow him, unless you believe that we should be directing the affairs of all countries in the world. Now, the other justification for covert action is proportionality, an old ethical doctrine as well, that you should not do more violence than is necessary to achieve the self-defense end in view. Now, we haven't always abided by that either. Don't get me wrong. I'm not justifying all these operations, but I'm saying these are the ethical and moral judgments that you need to apply on these, and that therefore means that if something is not a threat to you, you really don't have a right to go and turn it over. And Idi Amin was a terrible man, but he was no threat to the United States, and therefore he would not be an appropriate target of a covert action.
I'm going to go over to this side. Yes, back there.
How can democracy work fundamentally in the United States when foreign policy is made and carried out in secret, and when plausible denial, disinformation, and very restrictive reporting of the operations of intelligence agencies is all that's available in the country? Isn't it up to the American public to decide what our foreign policy should be, and not bureaucrats and federal agencies? This question is directed to both of the speakers.
The question is, how can democracy work when foreign policy is carried on in secret? Is it not the function of the American people to determine what policy shall be taken, and not of faceless governmental agencies? Mr. Stockwell, you first.
It's my assertion that it can't, and this is why I maintain that the CIA is a great enemy of democracy outside of the United States, as it overthrows constitutional democracies or manipulates them, and inside this country as it subverts the democratic process. One of the ways that we haven't mentioned tonight that it subverts this process is by propaganda, propagandizing the American people, pumping stories into the press that are false, arranging to have leaders make statements about foreign policy situations that are simply false in order to create a false impression. For example, in Angola, Ambassador Patrick Moynihan, our ambassador to the United Nations at that time, made numerous statements about the Cubans and Russians in Angola and about ourselves, which were all false. They originated in CIA headquarters and the subcommittee of the National Security Council. They had a great deal of influence on what people thought was happening in Angola. The same thing is being done in Nicaragua and Central America today. Leaders making statements that are false, and then the CIA backing it up by pumping propaganda into the United States press, articles in the newspapers, to twist our minds so that we see threats where they don't exist and see enemies where they don't exist. I don't think you can have a democracy where a secret police organization has perhaps 60% influence on our foreign affairs.
I'd say a democracy is alive and doing pretty well in this country. For one thing, you raise a legitimate problem, and what you raise is the necessity for some reasonable compromise between the secrecy that is involved in covert operations and secret intelligence activities, and our tradition that all that should be open, all that can be open, should be open. But we Americans have a lot of secrets in our life for various reasons. We have secret ballots, we have secret grand jury proceedings, we have secret income tax returns. We have all sorts of secrets. Why? Because it's necessary for the working of the institution that particular matter be held secret. Now, instead of having it's all secret or no secret, what we tried to construct is a system by which the public delegates to the Congress, and it delegates to some of the members knowledge of the secrets and the exertion of the judgments as to whether these are good or bad. Now, the committees of the Congress have full access to anything they want to know, and they have some independent observers and independent investigators that can go down, take testimony under oath, and find out what they need to know about it. And some of them do it very well, and some of them don't do it very well. There's no question about it. But I do deny that the CIA is congenitally trying to manipulate everything and trying to create a whole false impression. They are aware that if they get caught out in some improper statement that they're going to have the rug pulled out from under them on the next go-around of the appropriations, for one thing. And therefore, that is the control. And the press has a function in that, in the press raising these things to public attention. If the matter gets bad enough, it'll come out in the public. Or you'll have CIA officers who resign and go public and protest. And then the public can make a judgment about whether his protests are accurate, are well-founded, and whether something needs to be done about it. So again, I say that we can conduct secret operations, we can work out a system by which they can be controlled, and we have the fundamental potential of the independent press and the independence of our individual citizens who will blow out and make a noise about it. And so I get back to democracy, I think, is alive and doing pretty well.
I would have thought it unnecessary in this audience to chastise it for mumbling, snickering, and hissing while the speaker is speaking. I'd like it to stop. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, no, you're looking at me, yes.
Mr. Stockwell addressed this question first. Did the CIA, in fact...
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Frank, did the CIA...
I had inquired of a woman in a white sweater to pose the question. Yes.
My question is for either or both of the speakers. What other countries besides ours engages in these kinds of covert activities which we have heard discussed here tonight?
The question is, what other countries engage in the kinds of covert activities which we have discussed tonight? Mr. Stockwell?
Actually, I would like to defer to Mr. Colby if he would like to talk about that, because he had more experience as director in dealing with more countries. I saw Israel's activities in Africa, some liaison with them, and the British, whose morale had been broken considerably because of the penetrations of their service, and of course the Soviet Union doing quite a bit, not as much as we were, but doing quite a bit.
I'd say the basic answer is all of the above. Most countries engage in this to a degree and have for centuries. And the Venetians certainly did it in the Venetian Republic, and it's been going on ever since. Most of them.
I'm going to go to my right. Yes, the gentleman in a plaid shirt in the back. Yes.
Our president has expressed his approval of various private citizens enlisted in the Contra groups in Nicaragua. Recently there was a trawler seized off the coast of Ireland for sending arms to the Irish Republican Army. There seems to be a correlation between the shipping of armaments to Northern Ireland with possible arms shipments privately to Nicaragua. Is there some kind of legal liability on the part of those who ship arms to Nicaragua?
The speaker calls attention to a trawler seized off the coast of Ireland with a shipment of arms, and that there have been similar private shipments of arms to the Contras in Nicaragua. Is there some sort of correlation, and is there liability of the parties who are involved in those arms shipments? Have I got the question right?
The legal situation is fairly simple. There's a statute which says that American citizens will not launch expeditions against countries with whom we have diplomatic relations. And we also have a separate set of laws about the export of arms, which can only be done under license issued by the government. This does accept that the government can do this, so that it is improper for an individual to export arms or to engage in an operation, although it is legal for the government, duly constituted authority through the various procedures, it is legal for them to do it. The illegal part of the trawler outside of Ireland is that it apparently came from at least this continent, if not this country. And that does make it illegal because it probably was not issued with a license. The weapons given to the Contras would have been shipped in a covert manner, perhaps, but they would by CIA, but they would be sent by government authority in that situation. Now, you also have some few Americans have gone down there and signed up and gone and joined the effort. That is not technically illegal to do. It's not very wise, and I don't think it's very wise to encourage it, frankly. And here I would separate from the President in that regard.
I would add a little bit, without contradicting anything there, that we got into this law in the mercenary problem in Angola, and the United States law, it does prohibit recruiting people in this country to send them abroad. And the President is coming very close to encouraging people to break that law. It's a law that's never been enforced, I believe. But it is illegal to recruit mercenaries or send people, encourage people to go down, like to join the Contras and fight. I would like to support the judge and point out he's quite right about these lights. He can't see, and we can't see you nearly as well as otherwise. If they were a little dimmer, we could have better eye contact. And
there, something is starting to happen. Take them down some more. The side lights. Can you take the side lights down altogether?
The floodlights come.
Yeah, the floodlights on the side.
Floodlights on the stage.
Meantime, I'll try to see here to the left. Yes, in the dark sweater.
Whether Mr. Colby could comment on the CIA's view of the role of international law as regards CIA activities.
The questioner asked Mr. Colby to comment on his view of the role of international law. I'm sorry? More? Restate your. I'm not sure I've put the pieces together. Could you restate your question? The question is, will Mr. Colby comment on the CIA's view of the role of international law, for example, the World Court at The Hague, and the United Nations?
I can't speak for the CIA right now. I don't have any contact with it. But the fact is that we've undertaken certain international obligations. One of them is in the Rio Treaty, the Organization of American States, we have agreed that we will not involve ourselves in intervention in the internal affairs of other countries in the hemisphere. Now, international lawyers are well known for their ability to get through apparent impasses like this. And the way they usually go through that is by saying that there was a national reservation at the time of signing that applied to that, either spoken or unspoken. If you think I'm being cynical, I am. The fact is, however, I think the United States lost a great deal in the recent case in which it declined World Court jurisdiction in the attempt by the Nicaraguans to bring us to the World Court on the mining case in Nicaragua. I think it's a very bad precedent for the United States to decline jurisdiction of the World Court, and a very dubious case that we had there.
Mr. Stockwell, did you? No. Center section. All right, yes. Yes.
You were speaking previously about secrecy. I would like both of your opinions on some of the Reagan administration's regulations, specifically the regulations on trying to decrease or eliminate the Freedom of Information Act and make you sign what amounts to censorship for life. It occurs to me that had that been around when you two people were in the CIA, you both might not be authors to this day. I'd like both of your comments, beginning perhaps with Mr. Colby and Mr. Stockwell.
The speaker asks the questioner asks the speakers to comment on the efforts of the Reagan administration to restrict the flow of information by employees of the government, particularly the reductions in of access involving the Freedom of Information Act and the censorship of former government employees.
Hello, world.
Yes, that's good. We can now see you. Mr. Colby?
Two things there. The administration has recommended an amendment to the Freedom of Information Act, which I believe has passed one House but not the other, which would exempt the operational files of CIA from review under the Freedom of Information Act. This particular provision is endorsed by the American Civil Liberties Union. It is a realistic response to a problem that came up, that the agency is required to go through and look to see whether it should turn stuff over if a request is made. But then, in the original Freedom of Information Act, it can say, subject to court review, and on all the court reviews the government has won the case so far, that the matter should not be released for reasons of foreign policy or national security. So that's just a realistic recognition that it's a waste of time to go through all these things if you're probably not going to release it anyway on the operational. This is particularly a matter of concern to a lot of foreign contacts who are fearful that their secret relations with us will somehow be made public under the Freedom of Information Act. They're also concerned about Congress learning too much about it, and we have lost a number of people as a result of that concern. The second point about the discipline of employees, the Reagan administration came up with the idea of extending the kind of restriction that Mr. Stockwell and I are under to all government officials who have access to a special compartmented, very sensitive kind of intelligence information. Since this includes a lot of the high levels of the officials of our government, there was an immediate outcry about it, and the administration has withdrawn from that. We are under an agreement, that we are under a contract that we signed with the government some years ago that we will not publish matters dealing with intelligence without submitting it for prior review. I submitted my book for prior review, and it received a few minor changes, nothing of any great importance, but it did receive some changes that were not publicized, except in one little problem that got up, but I won't go into. But on the other hand, if someone does not submit it, as Mr. Frank Snepp and I gather Mr. Stockwell, then the government has proceeded against them for not having submitted it and exerted certain penalties as a result.
I take it the contractual arrangement is limited to the CIA. If you work for the State Department, you can write your memoirs, can you not?
Yes, it is limited. It is also true of the NSA and the DIA, I think. I'm not sure.
NSA, certainly.
Yeah.
Mr. Stockwell?
Once again, I see it from a different perspective. I see a movement afoot in this country by the power organizations in this country, including the CIA and, of course, the Reagan administration, what it's tried to do, but President Carter before, working in the same direction, to take your freedoms of press and speech and mine away from us. These are ancient American traditions, rights, and they believe that they have a greater right to secrecy. And they've come up with a rationale that satisfies them. As one of the American people myself, but one who's been inside and seen the cynicism of what goes on inside these organizations, I am deeply troubled about their rationales and even their good intentions. Now, we just heard the rationale that, of course, stirs everyone that there are certain foreign agents working for the CIA who would be very much afraid that under the Freedom of Information Act or a sharing of information or an open government, their identities would be exposed and they would be harmed. And that's true among those people. There are some fine people who are doing the right thing or think they're doing the right thing. There are also people like the ones who formed and run the death squads in El Salvador, which were formed by the CIA, who would, suffer if they were exposed. There are also lots of people inside this country who would like to know what their government has been doing to them. Remember I mentioned the MK Ultra program. All of the thousands of people who suffered from drugs and disease experimentation would like to know, what happened to them and who's responsible. And what I'm trying to say is that the government and the CIA has covered up a little bit of truly sensitive information, sensitive to our nation's security, and it's covered up and will continue to cover up a great mass of dirt if we take away the Freedom of Information Act and restrict our officials from being accountable to us for what they do.
Yes?
Two questions in helping me make a judgment. It was reported on NBC News tonight that Daniel Patrick Moynihan suggests that Contra handbook, the guerrilla handbook, was actually written in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And I wonder if I can buy that. And secondly, I think what he said. Comment on that. Comment on whether that makes any sense. And secondly, Mr. Stockwell, is it true what Mr. Colby suggests? In even any sort of relative sense, is the CIA on any shorter a leash today than it was 10 years ago?
All right. There are two questions from the questioner. One, that he says that he heard on NBC this evening that Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York had said that the handbook that had been unearthed in Nicaragua was, in the first instance, written for use in Vietnam or written in Vietnam. Is there anything to that? And I guess that question is addressed to both speakers. And then a second question addressed particularly to Mr. Stockwell. What is his view of the statement by Mr. Colby that the CIA is now under a substantially shorter leash than it had been in the earlier days of its operation? Why don't we begin with the first question, which is about the handbook.
Well, Senator Moynihan, who has the advantage of having the committee and its staff looking into this in detail, said that the manual is almost a carbon copy, translated of course, of a document produced in the Special Warfare Center of the United States Army in Fort Bragg in 1967, I think he said, and that it is an adaptation of old Maoist wording about what you do when a guerrilla force takes a town and how it handles itself there. That's what it is a great deal of. I don't know, frankly. I never heard of a document such as that, but I don't know.
Mr. Stockwell?
The CIA's leash is not much different from before. I'm dubious of the oversight process because I saw it working in the Angolan situation where the CIA was able to make a monkey out of the Congress by lying to them or deceiving them on essential important points and deflecting their scrutiny on others. What's different today is not that the system has changed as I see it, but there is not the atmosphere of scrutiny. The CIA is working today under a president who is very aggressive and has a mind that doesn't go into much detail about anything, and a CIA director who is known, I hear, in Washington as Wild Bill Casey, And then the Oversight Committee of the Senate under Senator Barry Goldwater, who's notoriously extremely aggressive and says publicly things like we should take Cuba, annex it, and make it into a state and whatnot. So the CIA is not in a position of needing to deceive them about what it's doing in Nicaragua. It has senators urging them to do more.
I'll take one more question from each section. Yes, back there. Yeah.
Given that Mr. Colby gave us the example of the first secret intervention or secret espionage activity in the United States as the French aiding the American Revolution in 1776, to what does he attribute the incredible bad judgment and continual support by the CIA of unpopular governments throughout the world for at least the last 25 years?
Given the example of Mr. Colby at the outset of his talk of the French engaging in a covert operation to assist the American Revolution, the questioner asked, to what does he attribute the extraordinarily bad judgment of the CIA in supporting losing causes over the last 25 years or so? Unpopular governments, I beg your pardon?
Well, I think it's not that clear-cut a case, quite frankly. There are a number of free governments extant in the world today which are stronger because of CIA activities some years ago. The Western Europe in the 1948 to 1950s was seriously concerned at the possibility of massive subversion by a massive political subversive program directed, funded, and managed from the Soviet Union. And that was met by some covert activities of the CIA. Now, today we're trying to get that same kind of activity of supporting democratic institutions done overtly rather than by CIA. And I, for one, am a great advocate of doing it overtly if you possibly can. There's a National Endowment for Democracy that's been set up, bipartisan, both parties, to support the training of political activists, trade unions, things of that nature around the world, which is exactly what CIA did during the 1950s in a vast variety of places around the world. There are other good results of CIA's covert actions. I mentioned Laos. I think that really was a very effective CIA operation with a very few people supporting a lot of Lao who wanted to fight to keep the North Vietnamese out of their homeland. The support that CIA gave to President Magsaysay so that he could become president of the Philippines instead of having a left-wing communist guerrilla force there or some right-wing corrupt bosses, I thought was along the lines that made sense. There are some other cases around the world. There are also, as I said, some very bad cases, and you're right there. The point is that these cases, the selection of what CIA would do, was undertaken not by CIA alone, but by our presidents over the years. And this is what clearly came out of the Church Committee of investigations. Senator Church asked the question whether CIA was a rogue elephant out of control. At the end of his investigations, he signed the report that said CIA is not out of control. If anything, it's been too much under the control of our presidents, is what he said.
This can still be debated. Senator Church did make that conclusion, and there are people inside the CIA, including myself, who felt that he just simply didn't press his investigation very hard. In my book, I bring out something that was already reported in the New York Times, that the National Security Council representing the President ordered the CIA not to endeavor to overthrow Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and the CIA did engineer his overthrow, just to cite one example. Also, the CIA and the FBI and the Army Intelligence and the others appearing all around the fringes, very close to the fringes of the assassination, the assassin of President Kennedy. You have to ask your question, who's in control of whom there? But I do also very much agree that some of the abuses of intelligence, as opposed to the covert action we've been discussing tonight, have been due to the CIA being too much under the influence of the politicians. An example, again, was in Vietnam, where we were prohibited from reporting about the corruption of the South Vietnamese Army because it would be a contradiction of Henry Kissinger's Vietnamization program. And, you know, it was true the Army was corrupt and couldn't fight, and it led to disastrous consequences for our foreign policy because we weren't permitted to report that for political reasons. By the way, since we're about to bring this to a close, I want to clear up one point so no one would have the misunderstanding that I came here to take a cheap shot at Mr. Colby on a personal basis. The way this debate got to be, in case you've forgotten, is in the Harper's Magazine debate in Washington. We disagreed on the subject of what you had told the Congress over the Angolan program, and I said we should debate this, and you said fine. And I contacted my agent and asked him to arrange this debate, which the Ford Hall, so I came here to do and did exactly what I was proposing to do when I challenged you at that time.
Although I had originally said I would take one more question from here and there, I'm looking at my watch. I think it is time to close it off. Otherwise, we could go the night. Thank you very much.
It's a lot easier with those lights in our eyes.
No, the lights are terrible.
Very nice to be with you.
I'm sorry that the questions were being directed so particularly at you, and I was